That's neat. Well, if you have a Bible and you find it helpful, and they're laying around in here. If you don't have one, you want to use one. They're all over the place. Turning it to Luke chapter 6. That's where we're going to be spending our time. Jesus' preaching, although great, it's a little hard for us to follow because Jesus taught as a Jew. And the Jewish rabbis had a word called charaz, which means stringing of beads. That's what it means. And that's how the Jewish rabbis taught. They would have a thought, they'd string a bead. That's the way they looked at it. And each one of the thoughts were kind of disconnected. They weren't linear. They weren't all connected up really well. And this is what you see in Jesus. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, which is where we are, you see this kind of individual thoughts being stacked on the string of beads. And that's the way Jesus taught. And the reason the rabbis taught that way is because they were afraid that the audience would lose interest. So they said, let's keep the topics moving. And that's the way they were trained to teach. Well, Jesus is going to string some beads for us today toward a certain lesson in our lives. So let's take a look at that. I'll begin reading in chapter 6, verse 37. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Forgive, and you'll be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, it will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you measure, it will be measured to you. Jesus also told them a parable. He said, can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? A student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like the teacher. Why do we look at the speck of sawdust in someone else's eye and pay no attention to the plank that is in our own eye? How can we say to someone, let me take the speck out of your eye, when we ourselves fail to see the plank that is in ours? Hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will clearly see to remove the speck out of someone else's eye. A good tree bears good fruit. A bad tree bears bad fruit. Each tree is recognized by its fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, nor grapes from briars. The good person brings out of their heart the good that is stored up in their heart. And the evil person brings evil out of their heart, which is stored up in their heart. For out of the overflow of the heart, the person's mouth will speak. Now, we read this text typically in the church. It's been taught that the text has to do more directly with God's relationship with us, but that's really not the context here at all. It's human relationships within the church. It's the way in which we're going to relate. Those of us who say we're followers of Jesus, we're being taught here how we're to relate to one another. And look, all of us, let's be honest within ourselves, we all judge people by the way they look or talk or whatever. We do condemn some people sometimes. We do. We forgive some people. We give to people. We give of ourselves. We discern. And we inspect other people's fruit. That's kind of what we do. Some of that's good, some of that's bad. And it's hard, if we're really honest within ourselves, for us to do that properly. We're just not able. We don't have God's perspective. And some of what we do has to do as much with us as it does with the other person. For instance, I feel this a lot. I was with Joan and Shirley on Friday, and her parents, Joan's parents, her mother specifically, who is dying and has died now. And for me, I can't speak for anybody else, but I don't know what it's like for you when you're with somebody who is really in bad condition or really suffering. You want to do something, but you feel helpless. But why is that? Why do we feel that sense of frustration or helplessness? If we're really digging deep and we want to become honest, it's because it hurts us that they're hurting. And the pain that's in us, we want it to stop. As much as we want to see that person no longer suffering, we ourselves want to stop suffering, right? people come to me, I've been asked this a lot, and Jesus speaks a lot about behavior here. There's no question about it. We're making judgments. We're going through our lives. We're making decisions. We're deciding things about people, deciding things about ourselves. People come to me as though I would know. I don't know. And they say, Rip, do you think it's right for me to do X? And my response is always the same. You already know the answer to that yourself. You don't need me to tell you that. Some people see it as a proper thing that we in the church should call out sin in other people. That we look at their lives, we say, you shouldn't be doing this, or you shouldn't be doing that, or this is what you should be doing. There's a church in our association, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but they actually have, if you join this congregation, you submit yourself to join, you have to sign a purity document. And there's a whole list of things that you should and should not do. You sign the document, and then, and this is how it works, if you're out in a public place and somebody in that congregation sees you doing something they find questionable, they have the capacity, if they're church members, to call you out. And if you or I were to not satisfy the requirements of repentance sufficiently, why, we'd be brought before the church for the church to pass some kind of judgment on us. We might even be kicked out. Now, I want to look at I look at this passage and I say, they're not reading the same Bible I'm reading. I don't see that at all. Think about Jesus. I mean, when he came to the woman at the well, all right, think what he did. He didn't judge her at all. He told her the truth about herself. He said, you know, you're spoken truly, because the man you're with is not your husband, and you've had 4 previous ones. And so, but that's not to condemn her. That's just telling her the way things are. And this unjudging attitude that we see in Jesus is exactly the kind of unjudging attitude that is like God. And when we exercise that unjudging attitude toward each other, we're being like God. I mean, isn't that something that we can so easily behave as God behaves toward us, toward one another? And this is what Jesus is trying to get us to see. I mean, after all, God blesses the whole earth every day. Whether a person is a Hitler or a Mother Teresa, they both have air to breathe, they got food to eat, the rain falls on their crops come up. Everything that we need in order to live, God blesses us with, no matter how we behave. That's the kind of mercy that God has. And so, in all of our duplicitous living, that is, we're double-minded, double living, God still blesses us in it. He doesn't condemn us for it. He still takes care of us. So when Jesus says, don't judge and you'll not be judged, what's he mean by it? That's really kind of the question, isn't it? I mean, does it mean that we should just have an absolutely non-committal attitude toward wrongdoing if we see it open in someone else? I don't think that's what he means at all. Because the rest of the passage kind of gives us an indication as to what he means, doesn't it? He says, hypocrite. That's the first, and that kind of stings a little bit. But then he says, look, if you will clean your eyes out, then you'll be able to see to help the other person clean their eyes out. So there's something going on there. There's a place at which you and I have a responsibility for one another, to protect one another from sin. But this idea of condemning and judging is not to be part of that. It's always going to be easier to see if our own garden has been cleaned up to go over and help somebody else weed theirs. But the first step is to weed our own. Always. Always. So, is it to say that there's nothing that we should teach, nothing we should ever recommend, nothing we should ever say to anybody? I don't think he's saying that at all. He's giving us the means by which we should properly judge. And that is that you and I would see ourselves for who we really are. A person who has come to God with all the dirt and just said, have mercy on me first. If we're coming like that, then we've got a perspective to bring to other people. It's not an ambiguous thing, it's something very directed, but there's a place in which you and I have to have some kind of cleansing that takes place within us before we're able to do anything like that. And think about it. I mean, this is the way God works with all of us, does He not? He works with us via our conscience. He tells us when we're messing up. Like Jerry Clower says, we know when we're messing up. We know that. We don't need somebody to come in from the outside, even with the authority of a church member, to tell us that we're in sin. We already know it. We already know it. Do we recognize that within ourselves first, is the question. And this is the way it works, if you think about it. God works through our conscience in that nobody in this room, if anybody in this room calls the name of Jesus as Savior, none of us can sin in comfort. Just can't do it. I mean, we talked about it in Sunday school this morning. There's going to be a portion at which, a place in our lives where we're going to be called out within ourselves. We already know there's a tension there that we all have. When we're in sin, we know that we're in sin. And we know that there's something wrong. And God, in His mercy, talks to us like that. Very quietly, very kindly. He never embarrasses us. He never calls us out in front of people. That's why that whole purity document thing makes me just a tad suspicious. I mean, if I see somebody in my life who I really, really care about, somebody I really love, and I see them in what I recognize as sinful behavior, the first response I'm to have for them is one of sympathy. Right? I mean, they're in a bondage. There's something wrong in them that needs a correction. I'm not the corrector. But they've got something going on in them that's very deep. And so for me, the response I need to have is one of saying, I feel terrible for them. Not one of saying, stick my finger out and point out what it is I think they're doing wrong. I remember reading, and I've had this experience myself. I don't know if you all have been in a situation like this. Jesus talks, there's another one of the strings of the beads that He puts on here, and it has to do with teaching. And He says to us, He says, a teacher has to be of a certain level in that sense. The student can't be above the teacher. And what it says to us is that we can't take other people where we ourselves have not been. I remember reading, or I shouldn't say that. I didn't read it. I experienced it myself. In being in a congregation where this group came into the church, and they got hold of the pastor and the leadership, and they started to take them in a place where the pastor and the leadership had never gone before. It wasn't very long before the pastor and the leadership wanted to take the congregation where they thought they needed to go. They themselves had never been there themselves. And it wasn't very long before the church split. This is critical for me, that any of us, I mean me, just because I'm standing here, but any of us, if we purpose to teach something in the church congregation, that we don't speak beyond our place. You know, I don't know is a good answer. That's a good answer. Jesus tells us here to be fruit inspectors of our own lives first before we bother inspecting other people's fruit. Lots of churches get into this. You see it in Acts chapter 20 where Paul says, ravenous wolves will be coming in. I fear for you. He said in tears, he told them, ravenous wolves will be coming. And they will undo all that's been built within this congregation as he left Miletus. That congregation that he left there. We're not immune to that. We're not immune to that at all. And so it seems to me that Jesus is giving us really good advice here and saying, do not teach beyond where you are. Do not teach where you are, beyond where you are. Then he talks about giving. Another bead gets strung onto the string. Now, I don't know where you all have heard this text preached before, but in my lifetime, every time I've heard it preached, it was always to do with tithing. If you'll give, then God will give back. That doesn't seem to me at all to be what Jesus is trying to communicate here. He's still talking about interpersonal things. And he's saying, look, if you and I are generous and giving toward each other, then when the time comes that we need to be given to, others will see that and they will give to us. And the imagery he uses is somebody coming up to a grain dealer with their robe. They don't have anything to carry the grain home in, so they take their robe and they pull it up, and the grain dealer pours the grain in, and then the person who's taking the grain shakes it, and it all settles down so there's room for more. And what he's saying is if we exhibit that kind of generosity between each other, then the generosity will come back. I know that all of this has typically been taught as something that God is doing, but it's also teaching us how to interact with one another. So the question is, what kind of fruit do we bear in our own lives? And here's where this passage speaks, I think, to human nature. If you pick up a magazine or a newspaper, or you pick up the television to watch a newscast, or you listen to something on the radio, how often is the news good? Not much. It's really mostly bad, and there's a reason for that. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you've ever read this novel, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. You may not have. Yeah. Anyway, he spends very little time describing the good guy and a bunch of time describing all the bad guys. There's something about us that likes the idea of seeing justice within our own lives. So when we watch the newscasts and all the news is bad, there's a reason we're drawn to it, because we think about all these bad things happening, and we think about the desire we have to see justice done to all of these bad people. We want to see them get it, right? We want to see them get theirs. That's just human nature. That's who we are. But there's a sense in which Jesus is trying to convince us here of the fact that this idea of judgment is something that should be so foreign to us, in that Jesus' blood was shed for all. It was shed for all, equally. His blood covered the sins of all of humanity, and you and I have no means to hold anything over anybody, no matter who they are. The only way that that fruit in our lives is going to be born out where people can see it, it's not going to happen when everything's going well. It always happens when things are going poorly for us. For instance, if I find, I'll just give you, for instance, in one of the lives I've interacted with in the past week, in Joan's mom and her dad as well. Here are two people whose lives, one of them has come to an end, the other's coming to an end. And yet, they are so filled up with who God's called them to be that they are giving out in kindness toward people around them when they really don't have, they would be perfectly excused if they were angry because of what's happening in their lives. And yet, they're showing something of themselves that God has given, that He's built into them. How many times have you heard somebody who, or I don't know, maybe this is one of us, I don't know. Have we been offended in some way? Maybe in a church setting. I know of this in this community, where someone was offended by somebody in a church, and instead of having sympathy, they just said, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm never coming back. They hurt me, and that's it. How opposite to what Jesus is trying to get us to be and to do, as this would be. Because the only time the fruit shows up in us is when things are going really badly. That's when people are going to see it. Just like with Joan's parents. Just like with a lot of people we know. I mean, when we're free and everything's going well and we're unbent, we don't have any real challenges, it's easy to show fruit then. It's easy to be a good person, a nice person. It's easy to look at what Jesus calls us to be and say, you know, I can do all of that. But when things are really hard, or when things are really scary, or when things really hurt, it's very hard for that fruit to show through. But when it does, that's when people's lives are changed by seeing it. I look at life on this earth, as I look at Jesus' words here, and I say, you know, I don't know that life on this earth for you and for me makes any sense at all without some kind of adversity being in it. I don't. I mean, lots of people who don't believe, they don't believe on the basis of the fact that God doesn't seem to make life really comfy and convenient for everybody, and so I'm not going to believe in Him. But to me, I don't see how we can even call life worth living, as I read this text, that we don't get the opportunity in things that are hard to show who Jesus has made us to be. I don't know that life even matters outside of that. The Bible speaks of us as heirs of all that God has. Everybody who calls the name of Jesus becomes an heir of all that God has. And in that heirship, think about it this way. We know people, we've seen them on TV, you'll see them in one of these documentary shows, or you'll hear of let's say a football player. All right, the football player plays college football, they're really, really good, and then a professional team signs them. Well, they give them $5 million as a signing bonus, and they sign them to a 5-year, $20 million contract. So this college student went from being a college student to a gazillionaire in a few hours. And then we look at their lives. How many times have you seen that story turn out where the person is 40 and retired from football and broke? Now, how do you get broke when you earn $50 million in your lifetime? I don't even understand that. But we see it all the time, don't we? Somebody goes and they go to the convenience store, and don't you hate this when you get to the convenience store and you just want to buy your soda? And somebody's up there buying lottery tickets, one after another, and you have to wait forever. You know, the ice is melting in the soda. It's not even going to taste good by the time you pay for it. And then there are these folks that hit it. You know, you see them on TV holding the big 4-foot wide check for 50, whatever it is, that particular lottery. And you can track the lives of the people who've had that happen to them, and you see them 4 or 5 years down the pike and they're broke. Somebody's committed suicide. What happened? I mean, the thing, I would like that to happen to me. That'd be great. $50 million. I mean, man, think of all the good things we could do if we had $50 million. Life would be so much better. But then we see 5 years down the road, they're broke. You and I are here on this earth being trained to be heirs of all that God has. If God took all of our lives and just made them perfect today, we would not be the people that are fitted to be with Him forever in heaven, because we wouldn't have been built that way. We'd have just been handed the whole thing, just like so many of these people who we see handed things like that, and then their lives are ruined. There's a process that God is using the things in our lives, the adversity, the hard things we go through, to give us an opportunity to begin to bear fruit. That's the whole purpose of what Jesus is trying to get at here. And these beads that Jesus has strung during this sermon, and will continue to string as we go through them, are all giving us the formula by which we can then take our lives and hand them back to God the way they're supposed to be. How many times have you ever borrowed something from somebody? They say, Rip, or like yesterday, Rip, our lawnmower broke down, and I went over to our neighbor's house and I said, can we borrow your lawnmower? Yes. So we used his lawnmower. When we got done with the lawnmower, we make sure it's cleaned up, full of gas. I want to give him the lawnmower back in better condition than he gave it to me to use. God has loaned us our lives. And He's giving us the chance to be built into people who can hand that life back better than we found it, in being heirs. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, talk to me about this church, talk to me about your life with the Lord, I'll stay as long as it takes as we close.